The studio lights blazed like miniature suns, reflecting off polished floors and casting long shadows across the crowded audience. It was supposed to be a routine anniversary broadcast, nothing more than a celebration, a victory lap for 4 decades of televised prophecy and influence. But the air felt strangely electric, as if the room itself sensed that something historic was about to unfold. Then the unexpected happened. The massive double doors at the back of the studio opened, and in walked Jonathan Roumie, quiet, composed, carrying nothing but a folded notebook in his left hand. No entourage. No loud entrance. No cameras following him. Just a calm presence that immediately shifted the atmosphere. Audience members nudged one another. Whispering started. The control room scrambled to switch to his camera angle. Even Pat Robertson, seated proudly at center stage, raised an eyebrow in surprise. Jonathan walked toward the panel table, his footsteps echoing through the studio like a slow drumbeat. Viewers at home leaned closer to their screens. Crew members stopped moving. The audience hushed itself without being asked. Something felt off, something big, something irreversible. Pat forced a smile, the kind he used on live TV for decades. "Well, Jonathan, we weren't expecting you so early." But Jonathan didn't return the smile. Instead, he placed his notebook gently on the table. "There are things the world needs to hear today," he said softly. The audience stirred. Pat's expression tightened. And then it happened. Jonathan opened the notebook, page after page filled with dates, claims, predictions, 40 years of them. Some the public remembered. Others had been buried under time, forgotten, or quietly ignored. As the camera zoomed in, people watching the live stream began flooding the chat with comments. Emojis exploded across the screen. Producers whispered frantically into headsets. "What is he doing? Stop the feed. Stay on him, this is huge." Jonathan lifted his eyes from the pages and said the words that would ignite the internet. "For 40 years you've spoken in God's name, but not all of it has been truth." A ripple of shock tore through the studio. Pat's face went red. The audience gasped in waves. Phones rose into the air like a forest of recording antennas. And then, leaning down from the shadows, a network executive whispered something into Pat Robertson's ear. And Pat's entire expression collapsed. The tension from Jonathan Roumie's unexpected entrance hung in the air long after the shockwave of his words settled. But before the world reached that breaking point, before the cameras caught Pat Robertson's expression collapsing, the entire day had already been building toward something none of them could have predicted. It began hours earlier. The network had transformed Studio 7 into a shrine of legacy. Giant banners showing Pat at different ages, golden lighting reflecting off crystal awards, clips from his greatest moments looping across enormous LED screens. The set designers had planned everything with ceremonial precision, down to the exact angle of the stage chairs. After all, this was supposed to be a celebration, a tribute to the man who had dominated religious broadcasting for decades. Backstage, staff moved like a practice machine. Makeup artists dusted cheeks. Producers revised cue cards. Assistants rushed around with earpieces and clipboards. Everyone knew Pat's reputation for perfectionism, and everyone knew today, his 40-year anniversary special, needed to be flawless. Pat Robertson sat confidently in his dressing room, flipping through his prepared talking points. Predictions he had made years ago. Achievements he wanted to highlight. Anecdotes from the old days. He planned to deliver all of it with the same authoritative tone he'd mastered over a lifespan on camera. But underneath the polish and preparation, something else was brewing, something only a handful of people backstage even sensed. Jonathan Roumie had been invited weeks earlier, but technically, he wasn't scheduled to appear until the final segment. His presence was supposed to be symbolic, even respectful, a younger face from a new generation, acknowledging the older giant. A handshake, a smile, a few compliments, maybe a prayer. That was the plan. But plans rarely survive reality. When Jonathan arrived at the studio that morning, he came quietly, without the usual celebrity protocols. No agent. No entourage. No rehearsed sound bites. Just a calm look in his eyes and a small leather notebook tucked under his arm. A stagehand noticed it first, the notebook. "You want us to place that somewhere?" Jonathan shook his head gently. "No. I'll keep it with me." Something in his tone made the stagehand pause. As the hours ticked down to showtime, the studio audience filled every seat. People of all ages. Fans who had followed Pat for decades. Families with posters. Elderly supporters who remembered his earliest broadcasts. Some had traveled across states just to be present in the crowd. This wasn't just a show to them, it was a milestone in the history of their faith. Pat entered the studio to thunderous applause. He raised his hands like a seasoned leader, basking in the admiration. Cameras swooped overhead. The opening music played. The lights dimmed for dramatic effect. Everything was unfolding exactly as Pat imagined it. What he didn't know, what no one knew, was that Jonathan had been watching the program from backstage, sitting silently in the corner of the green room. He didn't touch the snacks. Didn't scroll his phone. Didn't speak to anyone. His hand rested on his notebook, occasionally turning one page, then another, as if committing every word to memory. The pages were filled with dates. Predictions. Public claims. Unfulfilled promises that had been broadcast to millions over the span of 4 decades. Jonathan had researched every one of them himself. Cross-checked them. Verified them. Not because he sought confrontation, but because something inside him couldn't stay silent anymore. As Pat spoke on stage about faithfulness, destiny, and God's plan, Jonathan closed the notebook and whispered to himself, "Truth deserves its own moment." Meanwhile, out on the studio floor, the producers were feeling the pressure. The live show was moving too quickly. Applause breaks were running long. Pat was ad-libbing more than usual. He was enjoying the attention. Maybe too much. "Where's Jonathan?" a producer whispered. "He's coming in segment 4, another replied. "We need him in the audience shot in segment 2. "He didn't want to rehearse." "What? Why not?" "He said he'll speak when the moment is right." That sentence should have set off alarms. But the clock was ticking, and the broadcast marched on. Pat continued his speech, talking about visions, dreams, divine warnings. His voice carried an air of authority, the kind that had gone unchallenged for decades. But in the back of the audience, a few younger viewers exchanged subtle glances. They had grown up in a different era, one where information was cross-checked, archived, and accessible. They hadn't forgotten the predictions that never came to pass. Still, the celebration rolled forward. At exactly 1:17 p.m., a stage assistant tapped Jonathan's shoulder. "You're up next," she whispered. Jonathan nodded slowly and stood. Those watching backstage felt something shift. Not loudly, not dramatically, but unmistakably. Jonathan adjusted his jacket, picked up the notebook, and walked toward the doors leading into the audience. The world had no idea what was coming. But the moment he reached for the handle, a silence fell inside the studio, as if destiny itself held its breath. The moment Jonathan Roumie stepped through the audience doors, a hush rippled across the studio. It wasn't silence forced by producers or countdown signals. It was the natural kind, the kind that grows when hundreds of people feel something they don't yet understand. Jonathan moved with a calm, almost deliberate grace, the small leather notebook resting in his hand like a weight he had carried for years. Cameras swiveled immediately, focusing on him as though the lenses themselves sensed the story shifting. Pat Robertson noticed the movement and straightened in his chair, his smile stiffening. This wasn't the plan. Jonathan wasn't supposed to come out now. He was meant to appear later, during the feel-good closing segment, the one that would end with applause, prayer, and a standing ovation. Instead, Jonathan walked toward the panel table in the middle of Pat's monologue. The audience didn't know whether to clap, gasp, or keep still. Pat cleared his throat and tried to keep the tone light. "Well, Jonathan," he announced with a forced chuckle, "seems you just couldn't wait to join the celebration." A few scattered laughs appeared in the crowd, polite but uneasy. Jonathan didn't respond to the humor. He simply placed the notebook softly on the table. The sound of leather touching would felt louder than the applause that had introduced Pat at the start of the show. Pat eyed the notebook like it was a threat. Jonathan spoke quietly, but the microphone caught every syllable. "There are things that need to be said. Not from anger, but from truth." Producers in the control room panicked. "What is he doing? Is this scripted? No, this isn't in any segment. Cut the feed. Wait, the ratings are spiking. Don't cut anything. Pat leaned back in his chair. Jonathan, this is a celebration of God's work through 4 decades. Maybe save whatever concerns you have for private. Jonathan opened the notebook. The sound of pages turning echoed like thunder. On the first page was a date from decades earlier. Then a prediction. Highlighted. Documented. Proven false. The audience leaned forward. Some recognized the prophecy. Others pulled out their phones silently, already texting friends. You need to turn on the broadcast right now. Jonathan continued. Page after page. Dates. Claims. Predictions. Storms that never came. Events that never happened. Warnings that never materialized. 40 years of promises spoken with certainty, now laid out before millions. Pat's face flushed a deep red. His fingers gripped the armrests. What exactly are you implying? He demanded. Jonathan met his eyes, not with anger, but with clarity. I'm saying that prophecy isn't a show. It isn't a performance. And it isn't a tool for control or fear. It's sacred, and when it's used carelessly, it misleads people who trust you. Gasps broke out in waves across the audience. Pat slammed his hand on the table. You dare question my calling on live television? Jonathan didn't flinch. I question what is done in God's name, when it doesn't match the truth. The studio crackled with tension. A man in the third row shouted, "Let him speak." Another yelled, "Respect the legacy." 2 people started arguing. Security stepped forward nervously, unsure whether to intervene. The chaos spilled into the live chat. Fire, Jonathan is exposing everything. Fire, this is history. Fire, finally somebody said it. Fire, turn off his mic. Fire, Pat looks furious. Producers tried signaling Jonathan to wrap up, but he ignored the frantic gestures. He opened the notebook to the final page. This isn't about humiliating you, Jonathan said softly. It's about accountability. When people trust you with their faith, you owe them honesty, not showmanship. Pat's voice trembled, part rage, part fear. You have no idea what it takes to lead this ministry. 4 years, I have carried the burden of responsibility while the world judged me. Jonathan closed the notebook. Responsibility isn't about performing certainty. It's about admitting when you were wrong. The audience froze. Those words cut through the room deeper than any prophecy ever had. Pat stood up abruptly, knocking over his water glass. You came here to embarrass me, he snapped, pointing a shaking finger. You want to destroy everything I built. Jonathan shook his head. No. I want what was built to stand on truth, not illusions. Before Pat could respond, a sudden movement caught everyone's eye. A network executive stepped out from behind the curtains and whispered urgently into another producer's ear. The producer's face drained of color. Whatever was happening backstage wasn't minor. Jonathan stepped back, allowing the silence to settle. Pat looked around the studio, the cameras, the audience, the crew. For the first time in decades, he wasn't in control of the narrative. Everything he had built, every word he had spoken, every prediction he had made, was now under the brightest light it had ever faced. The studio felt like it had stopped breathing. For several painfully long seconds, no one moved. Not the audience, not the crew, not even Pat Robertson, who stood frozen beside the table with the water still dripping off its edge. Then the reaction began. It didn't start with noise. It started with disbelief. A woman in the front row covered her mouth. A young man in the back slowly rose from his seat, eyes wide. People looked at each other, silently asking the same question. Did that really just happen, on live television? Then the murmuring began, first faint, then gathering volume like a storm approaching land. Shock. Confusion. Curiosity. Anger. Claps. Boos. Cheers. Arguments. The studio turned into a thunderstorm of human emotion. But Jonathan Roumie remained completely calm. He stepped back from the table, hands folded gently in front of him, as if he had merely spoken a simple truth in a quiet room, completely unaffected by the chaos exploding around him. Security guards appeared near the stage, unsure whether they were supposed to protect Jonathan or restrain him. They glanced toward the producers for direction, but the producers themselves were in panic mode. Inside the control room, monitors flashed red warning boxes. Camera 3 losing focus. Camera 1 is too close. Pull back. Switch to wide shot. No, stay on, Jonathan. Ratings just spiked by 40%. We are trending on social media. Please, somebody tell me what segment we're in. No one had an answer. Back on stage, Pat Robertson was shaking, partly from rage, partly from humiliation. The small whisper from the network executive moments earlier had rattled him, and now the eyes of millions were locked on his every expression. He slammed his hand onto the table again. You think you can come onto my show, my platform, and tell me how to serve God? He shouted, voice cracking under the pressure. The audience erupted, some clapping for Jonathan's bravery, others shouting at Pat to calm down, a few yelling for security to intervene, and many simply filming the chaos with their phones. The comments below the live stream exploded faster than the moderators could keep up. Fire, this is insane. Fire, Jonathan is exposing years of lies. Fire, Pat is melting down on live TV. Fire, somebody stop this before it gets ugly. Fire, I can't look away. Jonathan raised a hand, not in anger, not in superiority, but in quiet, respectful patience. Please, he said softly, let's not turn this moment into a circus. But the studio had already become one. Pat attempted to take control of the narrative again. I have served millions faithfully. And you, he pointed at Jonathan with a trembling finger, you come here accusing me as if you are the judge of my calling. Jonathan's voice stayed level. I'm not your judge. The truth is. That line landed harder than anything he had said so far. Pat's mouth opened, but no words came out. His chest rose and fell unevenly. His confidence, once unshakable, was collapsing under the weight of scrutiny he had never expected to face so publicly. A man in the third row stood and shouted, Jonathan's right. We deserve honesty. Another woman shouted back, sit down, Pat changed lives for years. Two audience members began arguing loudly, forcing security to step between them. The executive who had whispered to Pat earlier stepped closer to the stage now, his expression dark and decisive. He held a folder in his hands, official, sealed, and heavy. Jonathan finally stepped forward again. This isn't about tearing anyone down, he said. This is about accountability. When leaders speak in God's name, those words carry weight. People plan their lives based on those promises. They trust. They sacrifice. They follow. Pat's eyes glistened, either with fury or fear. No one could tell. And when the things you promised never came to pass, Jonathan continued, people didn't blame you. They blamed themselves. They thought their faith was too small. Their prayers not strong enough. Their devotion not pure enough. A painful silence spread through the room. Jonathan closed the notebook one final time. This notebook isn't a weapon. It's a mirror. The audience fell quiet. Even Pat took a step back. Then, suddenly, every light in the studio seemed to shift as the network executive finally stepped forward into full view. He looked at Jonathan, then at Pat, then at the cameras. Everyone tensed. Producers leaned in. Audience members froze mid-breath. The entire live stream held its digital breath. Something big was about to be said. Pat opened his mouth. But the executive spoke first. Pat, he said quietly, we need to talk now. The entire room went still. Pat, we need to talk. Now. The network executive's voice wasn't loud, but it sliced through the studio with the sharpness of a verdict already decided. The audience fell into a heavy silence. Even the crew members, who were trained to remain unshaken no matter what happened on camera, stood frozen. Pat Robertson stared at the executive with visible trembling in his jaw. Talk, he repeated, his voice cracking. We're in the middle of a live broadcast. The executive stepped closer, his expression firm but not cruel. Yes. And that's exactly why this conversation can't wait. Jonathan Roumie stayed silent, stepping slightly aside. He wasn't there to take the spotlight. He was there to witness truth being spoken, and to let it unfold without interference. The executive opened the folder he had been clutching. Inside were documents, emails, internal reports, and viewer complaints, pages and pages of them. He held them like evidence in a courtroom. Pat's face drained of color. What is this?" he demanded. The executive took a deep breath. 40 years of broadcasts, Pat. 40 years of predictions, promises, and proclamations made in God's name. Some inspired hope. But many, he paused, choosing his words carefully. Many never came true. And the fallout from those false prophecies has damaged more families, and more lives, than this ministry can continue to ignore. A wave of shocked murmurs rose from the audience. Pat looked around in disbelief, as if expecting someone, anyone, to come to his defense. But the crowd that once adored him now stared with an unsettling mixture of confusion, hurt, and dawning realization. This ministry was built on trust, the executive continued. And trust is something we can't afford to lose. Pat's voice cracked. "You're firing me? After everything I've built?" The executive didn't answer immediately. Instead, he closed the folder and placed it gently on the table between them. "It's not about what you built, Pat," he said softly. "It's about what it became." A hush fell again, so deep you could hear the hum of the studio lights overhead. Jonathan finally spoke, his voice low but steady. "Sometimes the hardest part of leadership is admitting when it's time to step aside." Pat snapped toward him. "You caused this. You humiliated me. You think you know better than someone who has preached for decades." Jonathan met his gaze without anger. "No. I simply believe that people deserve truth. Not fear. Not theatrics. Not predictions disguised as divine certainty." He stepped closer, but his tone remained gentle. "You're not being removed because of me. This moment was coming long before I arrived." Pat looked at him with shaking hands. "You planned this," he whispered. "You set me up." "No," Jonathan replied. "I simply opened the window. The truth walked in on its own." The audience watched, stunned, as Pat's shoulders began to sag, his posture no longer that of the towering figure who had commanded the stage for decades. He suddenly seemed smaller, older, almost fragile. The executive placed a hand on Pat's arm, not harshly, but with solemn respect. "Pat, we're relieving you of your position effective immediately. After today, you won't be returning to broadcast." The words were delivered with finality. Gasps filled the studio. A few people cried. Some applauded softly, not out of disrespect, but from relief. Others simply stared, too stunned to react. Pat turned toward the audience, his lips trembling as though searching for the right words. But none came. For the first time in his long career, he was speechless. The cameras captured everything. The live stream overflowed with comments. "Fire, is this real? Fire, I can't believe this is happening live. Fire, Jonathan didn't expose him, he exposed himself. Fire, 40 years. Ending in one moment." Jonathan stepped forward, placing his hand gently on the notebook. "This wasn't meant to destroy you," he said quietly. "It was meant to free the people who trusted you. Because faith isn't about being perfect. It's about being honest." Pat closed his eyes, tears gathering at the corners. He wasn't a villain. He wasn't a monster. He was a man who had built something massive, something influential, something powerful, and had lost his way in the process. Slowly, painfully, he lowered himself into his chair. The executive whispered to the producers, "Cut to break after Jonathan speaks." But Jonathan didn't speak immediately. He surveyed the faces in the crowd, the confusion, the hurt, the hope, and then said, "Truth doesn't destroy a foundation. It rebuilds it." The lights dimmed. The audience exhaled. The countdown clock on the far studio wall blinked 00:58, 00:57, 0:56, each red number pulsing like a heartbeat. This wasn't a rehearsal. This wasn't a meeting. This was live television. One final broadcast the network had reluctantly approved under suffocating pressure from the public. Millions were waiting. Millions were watching. Millions were expecting answers. Jonathan Roumie stood just behind the curtain, head bowed, eyes closed, breathing slow and steady. He wasn't nervous. Not anymore. The storm had passed. The threats, the smear campaigns, the false articles pushed out overnight by hired PR teams, they had all failed. The truth had found its way into the light, and now the world wanted the rest. Across the stage, Pat Robertson sat alone at the long desk. No guests this time. No choir. No audience. The network wanted controlled conditions. Yet even in the emptiness of the studio, Pat seemed visibly smaller, like the collapse of his empire had slowly drained the color from his skin and the steel from his posture. His hands, once firm and commanding on television, now trembled slightly on top of the desk. A producer cupped his headset. "Going live in 10. Jonathan opened his eyes. Pat lifted his chin. The curtain rose. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. A soft chime rang, and the bright red on-air light flared. Pat forced a smile. "Welcome to a very special broadcast," he began, but his voice cracked halfway through, betraying exhaustion. "Tonight, we address the recent confusion." Confusion. The word echoed across the empty studio like an insult. Jonathan walked into the frame, calm, steady, unapologetic. Pat stiffened. He wasn't told Jonathan would enter so soon. The control room erupted into whispers, screens flickering as producers scrambled to adjust camera angles. Jonathan stopped beside him and looked directly into the lens. "No confusion," he said softly. "Just truth that's been ignored for a very long time." Pat inhaled sharply. "Well," he said, forcing composure, "truth is something we all seek." "You claimed truth," Jonathan cut in gently, "but you never allowed it to question you." Silence. Even the cameras seemed to hum louder. Jonathan reached into his coat and placed the notebook, the same one he first revealed days ago, onto the desk. But something else followed, a stack of envelopes, folded documents, and clippings sealed in transparent sleeves. Evidence. Receipts. Confirmations. The things the internet had been demanding non-stop. "These," Jonathan said slowly, "are internal memos, contracts, communication logs, documents confirming something the world deserves to know." Pat's face paled. "You don't understand the damage you're doing." Jonathan turned to him. "The only damage being done is to lies. And lies deserve to collapse." The control room panicked. "Cut to break. Cut to." But Jonathan raised a hand toward the nearest camera. "No cuts." And for the first time in the broadcast's history, there weren't any. Jonathan opened the top envelope and slid its contents forward. "These," he said, addressing viewers, "are proof that many of the prophecies broadcasted over 40 years weren't received, prayed over, or divinely inspired. They were drafted, reviewed, edited, scripted." Pat shook his head violently. "That's not true." Jonathan held up a page. "Then explain why these handwritten dates match your production team's meeting schedule." Pat swallowed. Jonathan opened another envelope. "These documents show sponsors paying bonuses when fear-based predictions boosted donations." Another envelope. "These reveal predictions altered to align with political shifts." Another. "These show entire prophecies rehearsed before going live." The lens zoomed in on Pat. He looked defeated. Frozen. Exposed. But Jonathan wasn't finished. He placed his hand on the notebook. "Everything in here, every promise, every failed prediction, every manipulated message, led people to believe God was confirming your words when he wasn't." Pat slammed his palm on the desk. "I believed them. I believed what I said." The words echoed. Raw. Desperate. Jonathan nodded. "Belief doesn't excuse deception. Not when millions relied on you. Not when families made life decisions based on your words. Not when donors gave money they didn't have because you promised blessings that never came." Pat's voice wavered. "I never meant to hurt anyone." Jonathan softened, just a fraction. "Then tell them the truth." The studio went still. Pat stared at the camera, eyes trembling, throat tight. Decades of power had never felt so heavy. Finally, slowly, painfully, he exhaled. And whispered, "I was wrong." Jonathan stepped back. Pat continued, voice cracking. Some predictions were exaggerated, some were shaped by the moment, some were not from God. The control room froze. History was being recorded in real time. Jonathan spoke one last time. Truth isn't the enemy. It's the beginning. The red light above the camera flickered. Transmission ended. But the world had only just begun to react. It erupted. Within seconds of the transmission cutting to black, every major platform exploded. Hashtags, live stream reactions, emergency discussion panels, pastors debating pastors, reaction channels dissecting every frame. Millions had witnessed something no one thought possible. Pat Robertson confessing, on air, that many of his prophecies weren't from God. You could practically feel the tremors inside the internet. Echo chambers cracked. Long-standing supporters sat frozen. Critics celebrated. Confused onlookers replayed the final minutes again and again. And somewhere in the midst of all that digital chaos, Jonathan Roumie quietly stepped out of the studio and into the cool night air, alone, unnoticed, almost invisible compared to the firestorm behind him. He inhaled deeply. It smelled like freedom. A black sedan rolled up to the curb. The same network executive who had whispered in Pat's ear earlier, Gerald Langston, stepped out, his expression a complicated mix of irritation and reluctant admiration. He straightened his tie and approached Jonathan. "You understand what you've just done?" Gerald asked. Jonathan didn't answer immediately. He simply looked at the studio building glowing behind them, the monolith of a media empire that had shaped millions of beliefs. Now it looked smaller, like a giant shrinking after exposure to the truth. "Yes," Jonathan said eventually. "I told the truth." Gerald scoffed. "The truth is expensive. You've cost this network sponsors, political allies, donors, partnerships." Jonathan cut him off with a glance. "I didn't cost you anything. Lies did." For a brief moment, Gerald looked like he wanted to argue. But then he sighed, rubbing his forehead. "You know, people are calling this the biggest religious scandal of the century." Jonathan shrugged. "Maybe it needed to happen." Gerald stared at him with narrowed eyes. "You're making enemies. Powerful ones." "I didn't come here for enemies," Jonathan replied quietly. "I came here for answers." Before Gerald could respond, Jonathan turned and walked away. Across the city, Pat Robertson sat alone in his dressing room. The lights around the mirror still glowed, harsh and unforgiving. His reflection stared back at him, tired, aged, and stripped of the authority he once carried effortlessly. He replayed the moment over and over in his head. Not the confession. Not Jonathan's confrontation. But the silence afterwards. The silence was what shattered him, because for the first time, he had nothing left to hide behind. A soft knock echoed from the door. "Come in," Pat muttered. The door opened, and a familiar figure stepped in, Martha, his longtime assistant. She had served him loyally for over 20 years. Tonight, however, her expression wasn't one of loyalty, but of worry. "Are you all right?" she asked gently. Pat tried to smile, but the attempt crumbled. "I don't know," he admitted. Martha hesitated, then sat beside him. "You did something brave tonight." Pat laughed, dry, humorless. "No. Jonathan did something brave. I just surrendered." "That's still something," she whispered. Pat shook his head. "You know what scares me most? Not that people will hate me. Not that I'll lose everything. What scares me is realizing I convinced myself for years that I was doing God's work, even when the evidence said otherwise." Martha placed a hand over his. "Self-deception is the easiest kind, and the hardest to heal." Pat closed his eyes. "I want to make things right, but I don't know how." "Start by telling the whole truth," Martha said softly. "Not just on air. To yourself." Meanwhile, Jonathan walked through the quiet streets, phone buzzing non-stop in his pocket, calls from journalists, producers, influencers, religious leaders. He ignored all of them. Tonight wasn't about publicity or attention. It was about peace. He reached a small park, empty except for a couple of streetlights flickering overhead. He sat on a bench, finally letting the weight of everything settle on him. He didn't feel victorious. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt relieved. But as he stared at the sky, something shifted, a faint prickle at the back of his neck. Not fear. Not paranoia. Awareness. He wasn't alone. From the shadows between two trees, a figure stepped forward. A tall man in a gray suit, face unreadable, movements precise. "Mr. Roumie," the man said calmly. "We need to talk." Jonathan stood slowly. "Who are you?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he held out a sealed envelope. "Everything you think is over is just beginning." Jonathan stared at the envelope. Cold, heavy, unfamiliar. The man turned and vanished into the darkness as silently as he had appeared. Jonathan remained still, the envelope resting in his hand, the night suddenly colder than before. Something new had begun. And whatever it wasn't friendly.